I was talking to Amy about which picture to use, and I said, well, find me something where he's looking kind of mean and argumentative. And she said, they all do. So I said, anyway, so she found that one there, and there you have it. Well, when Neil Young had a brief rockabilly phase during the late 1970s, he penned a song that I think helps us understand how he thinks about the world. The song was Hey, Hey, My, from 1979, and it contains these lyrics. Out of the blue and into the black, they give you this, but you paid for that. And once you're gone, you can never come back. It's better to burn out than to rust. The king is gone, but he's not forgotten. It's better to burn out than to rust. Here in a nutshell is Neil Young's way of seeing the world, of living near to the edge, of not avoiding risk, but rather courting it, and all the consequences of living close to the edge. Another essential component of Neil Young's personality is his self-definition as a loner. Neil Young began his solo career in 1968, and his first album included a song called The Loner. And one site commenting on this song observed, this song was a statement of individualism, one in which attainment of knowledge is the sole ultimate truth available to the alienated. And here are some of the lyrics to that song. He's a perfect stranger, like a cross of himself and a fox. He's a feeling arranger and a changer of the way he talks. He's the unforeseen danger, the keeper of the key to the locks. Know when you see him, nothing can free him. Step aside, open wide. It's the loner. By the way, I had a lot of fun during this week. I probably spent about 15 hours on the internet one of those weeks. And it was all these songs are available out there. So as I'm mentioning these songs, I'm going to show you 2 clips during today's message. But if you find that there's a song that you're thinking, I wouldn't mind hearing that one, they're all out there. Well, both of these values, Young's belief that it's better to burn out than to rust, and his self-definition as a loner, help us understand why he'd be willing to take unpopular stands and write songs about controversial political issues. There was his famous song, Ohio, written after 4 students were killed at the Kent State campus in 1970. He's made frequent public political and anti-war statements. The 2006 album, Living with War, for example, includes the song, Let's Impeach the President. He's been an advocate for biodiesel fuel, which led in 2008 to an electric car project and accompanying album called Link Volt. And he's not been afraid to step in and even criticize his fellow musicians. I'd like to show you now a clip of a song that he wrote that was called This Note's for You. And he was picking up on the tendency in the 1980s for artists like Michael Jackson and others to hop on the commercial bandwagon. And he said, I'm not for sale. Okay, so we cut it off there because it's a long clip. And it gets a little distracting, shall we say. So I would advise you or invite you if you want to go and have a look, have a peek at that. But the reason I wanted to show it to you is because he has an edge. He has an edge there. And I have to tell you, I actually heard that song here in Calgary. It was 1989. First of all, MTV banned it. And they said, we're not going to play this clip. And then there was a big fuss, and this was the beginning days of the power of the Internet, and people said, you know what, you should play this. And they made it the video of the year in 1989. So first they banned it, and then they made it the video of the year. But I heard it, actually I was shopping in doesn't matter, but it was Market Mall on the 2nd floor of the Bay, and I'm walking around, and all of a sudden I see this song, and it just completely floored me. Because I thought, okay, here's a guy who's, going totally against the prevailing musician values, which are kind of cash in while you can. And I want to remind you, last week we talked about Pete Seeger, and what did he do? The Weavers wanted to do a cigarette ad, and he said, you know what, guys? I'm out of here. I'm not doing that cigarette ad. You go right ahead. I'm out. So it's an interesting kind of a situation where you have these 2 cranky guys who are taking stands. Well, given his willingness to court controversy, it should perhaps come as no surprise that Neil Young stepped into the fray when, as many of you will know, earlier this year he compared Alberta's oil sands to Hiroshima. And by the way, while many commentators, including my wife, focused on the obvious fact that Neil Young's views on the oil sands are misinformed, somewhat lost in the discussion was the fact that he was attempting to raise funds for First Nations treaty defense and did so to the tune of $500,000. Well, when all this happened, I was thinking about this mini-series about the prophets. And 2 weeks ago, we heard that Walter Brueggemann, in his book, The Practice of the Prophetic Imagination, wrote that the task of the prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. So I started to think to myself, can we see Neil Young as a prophet? Well, it turns out there's a lively debate, and that's how some of my hours were spent. There's a lot of discussions. I came across, for example, on the site sonicyouth.com, a blog thread entitled, Neil Young, Dumbest Man Alive or Prophet of God? I also came across an interesting sermon preached back in 2007 by the Calgary pastor John Slotin of the New Hope Church. I expect many of you have heard him. He's in the news now and again. He preached a sermon using Young's music to talk about God's love, beauty, and truth. And he suggested that all of these qualities are found in the music and life of Neil Young. And Slotin went further. This is before I had come up with thinking about this, but he'd already written about it. He suggested that Neil Young is a prophet. In Slotin's view, quoting Walter Brueggemann once again, he says, the task of prophetic ministry is to nurture and nourish and evoke a consciousness, as we heard, an alternative consciousness to the dominant culture all around us. And he said, Slotin, prophecy does two things. It criticizes and it energizes. So in this sense, then, as an energizer and as a person who evokes a consciousness and a perception alternative to the consciousness of the dominant culture around us, Neil Young can be seen as a prophet. I also found an interesting article with a very long title, and I'm giving it to you just for fun. The Vision of Prophetic Christianity in Neil Young, The Paradox of Divine Morality and the Evolving Ethics of Rock and Roll, Part 3. I looked for about half an hour for Part 1 and Part 2. And I think it was a joke because there was no Part 1 and Part 2. Anyway, I looked for it, but it wasn't out there. In this article, the authors write, transformation in popular rock music in the early 1960s reflects a spiritual diversification and religious broadening of the genre beyond adaptations of traditional morality rooted in Christian ethics of salvation. Neil Young is an artist who illustrates well a prophetic Christianity in terms of the paradox of divine morality. Sorry, this is fairly heavy stuff. It was written for a PhD program. Humans can and do change their world, influence the actions of others, and are capable of doing their best while still unequipped by any divine moral knowledge. This is what they argue. Adherence to one principle, in Young's case, the resolution, definition, and redemptive actions of the individual, characterizes this theological viewpoint, one that enables a physical and spiritual environment Young would define throughout his career. They also observe, these social interactions are critical to affirming Young's spirituality as representing a prophetic Christianity, one in which an individual's actions towards establishing a common good are essential, as humanity is responsible for the creation of its own ethics. Well, I don't know if you're with me so far, but if we are willing to accept the idea that Neil Young could be seen as a prophet, we have to admit that in his view, it's the individual on fire and committed that really matters. God doesn't make much of an appearance in his work or his thought. Unlike, say, Bob Dylan, whose conversion to Christianity was famously given voice by his song, You Gotta Serve Someone. Perhaps the closest Young ever came to speaking about faith through his music is through the song When God Made Me from his 2005 Prairie Wind album. This song offers a series of questions. Was he thinking about my country or the color of my skin? Was he thinking about my religion, the way I worshiped him? Did he create me just in his image or every living thing? When God made me, Was he planning only for believers or for those who had just faith? Did he envision all the wars that were fought in his name? Did he say there was only one way to be close to him? When God made me. I want to play you now a clip of that song, and this is Neil on the piano, and it's sort of Neil at his introspective best. So let's hear this clip, When God Made Me. Well, by now I think you will have made up your own minds as to whether you think Neil Young can be thought of as a prophet. I've tried to suggest that his concerns are similar to a number of key issues for folks in the United Church. They have to do with thinking about people without voices and standing up and trying to make a difference in the world. And in this way, his views of justice, they put him in line with the biblical tradition of the prophets. His own identity, that of the loner, combined with his apocalyptic views that it's better to burn out than to rust, lend a tone of urgency to his pronouncements. He clearly believes that he has the moral right and the moral imperative to speak for those who have no voice. All this might make us uncomfortable and even angry, and I concede again that he didn't have his facts right when it regards the oil sands. But does that mean that he should be treated with contempt or as a hypocrite? I think not. Like it or not, he has a right to speak, and we are invited to listen. Whether we do anything with what he has to say is the same question we might ask ourselves whenever we encounter people we disagree with. Do they have anything to say to us at all? Perhaps the most important thing for us to take away here is that the prophets, whether in the Bible or the present day, are not necessarily likable or palatable. Their job is to awaken us to other possibilities, to get us talking and thinking about things. They are people who paint in broad brushes, who speak of alternative visions, who call for a new awakening. In this sense, they are all living out the vision of Isaiah, the most famous prophet of them all, when he observes, "Remember not the former things, nor consider things of old. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" What is this new thing that God would have us do? In concluding this mini-series on the prophets, I remind you that it is not my role to provide answers to such questions. Rather, we are all invited to encounter the biblical voice of the prophets, and perhaps their modern-day equivalents, and determine which actions, if any, we want to take as a result. May God grant us wisdom and open our hearts and minds. Amen.